Picture this. You're just 14, stripped bare in a freezing stone room as unfamiliar women's hands explore your most intimate areas. The Duchess of Bedford observes with sharp, assessing eyes while two midwives inspect you like an animal up for sale. Your shaking isn't from the February cold creeping through ruined castle's walls. It's pure fear. These women grip your whole future in their rough hands. One wrong word from them, one claim that your purity's been lost, and your world crumbles. You're no ordinary girl. You're Blanche of Navarre, destined for queenship, and this inspection will decide if you rise to royalty or fall into ruin. Before we plunge into these overlooked tales of endurance and agony, if you love uncovering history's buried secrets, go ahead and tap that like button and hit subscribe for more like this. And drop a comment below sharing where you're tuning in from. It's amazing how we're all connecting over these old stories from spots around the globe, linked by our fascination with the past across eras and distances. The year was 1453. After 13 long years wed to Henry IV of Castile, Blanche underwent a formal check that verified her untouched state. 13 years. 13 years sharing a bed with a man who never laid a hand on her. 13 years of shame masked as a noble union. 13 years of hushed gossip about what was off with her or him. Now, at 29, she'd be stripped and scrutinized by outsiders to confirm what her body had silently borne. But Blanche's ordeal wasn't one of a kind. In the dim halls of medieval might, every woman who claimed a throne or aimed for one confronted a brutal truth. Their bodies weren't theirs alone. They were goods to be checked, tried, and confirmed by the same men who swore to guard them. Medieval Europe ran on lineage and legacy. Purity was a prized asset, mainly because it was the surest way to confirm fatherhood. In a time when bloodlines decided realms' destinies, a woman's intactness became the final stamp of legitimacy. The only certain path to ensuring a child from a union would inherit from his dad was to wed an untouched bride. The checks themselves varied, each more prying and demeaning than the last. The clearest method to confirm a woman's purity was to examine her barrier. But medieval thinking, warped by myths and urgency, invented much more twisted and shaming approaches. Think about the sieve trial, a ritual so ridiculous it'd be funny if it weren't so vicious. A popular way to gauge a girl's untouched status was to give her a sieve and watch if her pure hands could make it hold water. A dripping sieve mirrored a flawed body and marked a tainted girl. Women stood before groups of male watchers, frantically trying to stop water from leaking through a simple kitchen item's holes, with their good names on the line. Even stranger were the urine checks. Medieval healers thought they could spot purity by studying a woman's fluids with the assurance today as docs test samples. A 13th century guide called De Secretis Malorum says virgin urine is pure and bright, sometimes pale, sometimes shimmering. Another specialist suggested watching the act, noting a virgin pees with a faint whisper and actually takes more time than a young boy. Picture the shame. Hibern, ladies, offspring of rulers, made to relieve themselves before male healers who swore they could detect honor. In the noise of liquid hitting a pot, the degradation was planned, deliberate, and seen as totally ordinary. Some checks veered into the mystical. A 14th century author, John of Trevisa, proposed a magnet trial to catch a wife straying from her vows. Placed under a faithful wife's head, it'd draw her to hug her husband suddenly. But if she was unfaithful, it'd jolt her from bed in terror from a nightmare. But maybe the most dreadful were the smoke trials. Niccolo Falcucci, a 15th century Italian healer, described covering a woman with cloth and exposing her to the finest coal fumes. If untouched, she wouldn't smell it through her mouth or nose. Women were essentially cured like meat as healers monitored their responses to poisonous vapors. The women running these inspections were usually midwives, who should have been allies in hardship but instead turned into tools of control. Some midwives, showing true solidarity, declared a woman pure even when she wasn't. But most were straightforward in their judgments, and their verdicts often doomed their sisters to ruin. Why would women turn on each other so easily? It boiled down to the choking grip of medieval life. The weight of subjugation pressing on women was so vast, so everywhere, so baked into everything that most bought into the lies painting females as evil, unreliable, lesser, and deceitful. The risks were sky high. A botched purity check meant worse than social fallout. It could mean the end. In certain places, failing to prove intactness led to open killings. In others, it brought banishment, desertion, or a life-scraping by on the streets. For women of rank, the fallout was often diplomatic alongside personal. A queen doubted in her purity could spark global crises, battles, or the collapse of hard-won pacts. Catherine of Aragon's nightmare shows how these checks turned into tools for political fights. When Henry VIII pushed to end their union in the 1520s, Catherine swore until her last breath that she'd arrived in Henry's bed untouched, never having fully joined with his brother Arthur in her first marriage. For years, this dignified Spanish royal had her deepest physical moments picked apart by scholars, legal experts, and leaders who ignored her honor and chased their agendas. Henry had to show Catherine had completed her bond with Arthur, to argue their marriage defied holy rules, which turned out tougher than expected since Catherine held firm she'd come to him pure. The very form that had been inspected and cleared for one royal match was now doubted and attacked for another. The inspection routine was like structured torment. Women of status would be undressed completely and laid out on slabs like samples for study. Several onlookers would watch as midwives or healers delved into their bodies, hunting signs of encounters. The barrier, that delicate layer that could break from riding horses, hard work, or countless innocent things, became the top judge of a woman's value. Some women lack barriers from birth, and others lose theirs early from the tough tasks filling women's days back then. But these facts meant zilch to medieval folks fixated on female chastity. A missing or damaged barrier was instantly seen as proof of intimacy, no matter the real reason. Joan of Arc's case shows how purity checks stretched past marriage games into matters of holy power. A check of Joan's intactness happened before January 13, 1431, led by the Duchess of Bedford. The initial step was verifying her purity, because it was thought virgins were harder for evil to sway. Even as Joan dealt with heresy accusations that'd lead to her burning, even as she faced endless questioning meant to crush her will, she endured the same shaming body check that all key women faced. Her purity was tested not once, but several times. A quiet check by two women affirmed it. Later, the Duchess of Bedford and her group did another. The bitter twist was overwhelming. Joan, who said she got messages from above, who rallied the French to beat the English, who shifted history with her battlefield smarts, was brought low to sprawl naked on a surface while Hibernian women scanned her form for proof of her moral fitness. Her bravery in war counted for nothing next to her barrier state. Joan's accusers knew these checks' strength. Joan was then moved to Tours for a body check by women under Charles's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, who confirmed her purity. This aimed to prove she might be the foretold untouched rescuer of France, to highlight her commitment's cleanness, and to confirm she hadn't dealt with dark forces. The religious angles were mind-blowing. Medieval faith built a system where a woman's holy standing hinged fully on her body state. Heaven's words could apparently only come through unbroken barriers. Sacred insights needed hands-on proof for mortals. For the women who got through these trials, the scars went way beyond the room. They carried the awareness that their hidden times had been breached, recorded, and wielded as ammo in power plays and faith debates. They knew their forms were never really private. They were owned by dads, spouses, councils, and faiths that demanded to inspect them on a whim. Some women pushed back with tricks. Old stories brim with tales of smart women who faked purity when needed. One take from the Trotula offers tips for a woman in that spot. The day before her wedding, have her carefully place a leech on her sensitive spots, watching it doesn't slip inside. Then blood will drip there, forming a small scab. The leech trick was clever and awful. Women would purposely harm their tenderest areas, letting the critters drink their blood, all to mimic an intact barrier on their marriage night check. The agony had to be intense, but it beat the fallout of flunking a purity test. It wasn't hard for a crafty, but experienced bride to snag some blood. Most homes back then had nearby farms, with animals slaughtered regularly for meals. A drop of bird blood could be tucked in jewelry and smeared on sheets in the shadows. Other ways were just as frantic. Tricks included timing a wedding during her cycle or quietly swapping the bride with someone else for the joining part. The planning and teamwork these ploys demanded highlight the sheer dread these women felt. Some went for basic body fixes. The Trotula recommends a tightening mix for the area so women seem untouched. Whip egg whites with water boiled with pennyroyal and warm herbs. Dip fresh linen in it, and apply inside 2 or 3 times daily. The panic in these steps is gut-wrenching. Women risked stuffing harmful stuff into themselves, injuring with leeches, plotting big swaps with stand-ins, anything to dodge a failed check's doom. The marriage night turned into yet another inspection. Usually, though, the real confirmation of purity came as it vanished. Bed sheets marked with blood was all a groom required to prove it. Actually, those stained sheets were sometimes grabbed from the bed and paraded to folks as signs of the night as chastity. The day after a high wedding, staff would hurry to skin the linens for red spots. These would be shown to guests, kept as records, and even shipped to distant lands as evidence of a proper union. A woman's most personal instant became a show for all. Her hurt and blood turned into bargaining chips. In Armenia, marriage night purity checks are called the red apple custom. In Georgia, a blood ritual is part of weddings in some Azerbaijani groups. These habits, lingering in places today, link straight back to old European ways. The sad joke of these blood rites was how unreliable they were. Barriers stretch and tear from all sorts of movement beyond intimacy. A woman might be truly untouched, but still not bleed on her first time. Yet, this truth got overlooked for a ritual that eased male worries about women's desires while proving nothing real. Royal healers and faith leaders knew these checks were iffy, but they kept them up because they filled a bigger role. They weren't truly about spotting purity. They were about dominance. They ensured every woman, no matter her status or strength, knew her body could be probed, doubted, and ruled by men anytime. The mental toll was huge and enduring. Women who faced these inspections often spoke of feeling ashamed, invaded, and detached from themselves. They came to see their bodies as props to handle, not homes to live in. They learned their value as people rested on a tiny bit of flesh that could rip from something as harmless as a horse ride. Catherine of Aragon spent years justifying her purity in hearings across Europe, even if her tie to Arthur went unfulfilled, and Catherine vowed to the end she'd met Henry untouched. Henry's twist on that sacred text meant their bond was sinful in divine eyes. She had to recount her private times openly, face grilling on her encounters, defend her body's wholeness against foes who dismissed her pain. The inspection spaces were built to amp up the shame. Chilly stone rooms with bare setups, groups of watchers to block any secrets, and a vibe of cold analysis that handled women like things, not people. The women doing these checks were taught to be detailed, intrusive, and blank-faced. Some sessions dragged for hours. Different healers or midwives would rotate, verifying and re-verifying. Women were placed in humiliating stances, legs wide as strangers poked with chilly tools. They couldn't talk, object, or react during it. The after effects often hurt more than the check. Botched purity tests could lead to quick death, exile, or endless lockdown. Even passing offered no sure shield. It just pushed back the verdict to the next probe, the next trial, the next chance for male powers to claim rule over female forms. Blanche of Navarre's past check in 1453 should have been a win, but it was empty relief after 13 years of a hollow marriage and open mockery. Afterward, Blanche was shipped back to Navarre. She'd shown her purity, but it cost her youth, her pride, and her hopes for a real partnership. Her tale exposes the no-win spot for medieval women of rank. Fail the checks and face shame and penalty. Pass and get tossed aside regardless. Their role as alliance pieces worn out by the very rituals meant to guard their repute. The records of these checks were precise and belittling. Palace logs describe women's forms in stark terms, noting barrier states, genital looks, and the examined women's responses. These files lasted decades, even ages, making one check's shame ring through time. Joan of Arc's hearing docs include full notes on her purity checks, penned by men who found no issue honoring her as heaven's voice while using her body as court proof. Her judges likely heard whispers that at Beau revoir, Jean de Luxembourg's castle where he sold her to the English, his aunt, wife, and daughter backed Joan and urged him not to deal her away. Yet even her fans saw no problem scanning her bare form. The faith-based excuses for these checks were especially warped. Medieval beliefs held the body as a sacred space for the divine, yet it also treated women's forms as scenes to investigate. The same system preaching human worth routinely crushed that worth for purity's sake. Joan adjusted her prior words by saying her faith in rescue depended on holding her vow to the Lord to guard her body and soul as purity. Even Joan grasped her holy value linked to her physical self, that her talks with holy figures meant zero if her barrier was harmed. The checks also exposed medieval medicine's deep cluelessness. Healers claiming skill in purity detection often knew squat about women's builds. They mixed up normal barrier differences with signs of intimacy. They read everyday body functions as moral flaws. Some checks were so silly they neared humor, except for the real pain they inflicted. Notions that pure girls could trap water in sieves, that their fluids gleamed uniquely, that they responded to magnets in set ways these ideas would amuse if they hadn't wrecked endless lives. Still, women devised ways to fight and flip these setups. Stories suggest women could beat the sieve trial by lining it with lanolin. They passed tips on faking blood marks, tightening inner muscles, sensing cycles with checks. These rebellions took massive guts. Women nabbed cheating on purity checks faced far harsher fates than plain failures. They got charged with lies, scams, and upsetting the order. Yet they kept aiding one another, building hidden webs of info and help outside official paths. The money side of these checks was massive. High marriages brought huge payments, land swaps, and deals worth treasures. A flunk purity check could void packs richer than most folks saw ever. Women's barriers became bases for world trade. When they were married, Catherine was around 23, and Henry was about 18. Catherine arrived with a massive dowry from Spain, packed with land rights and business perks that boosted Henry's dad to insane riches. When Henry pushed later to scrap their union, Catherine's untouched status turned into a courtroom and money fight that dragged in judges all over Europe. The checks also doubled as power plays. Claims of broken purity could wreck competing bids for crowns, ditch unwanted spouses, or back up bold war moves. Rulers eyeing divorce would abruptly fuss over their wife's past purity, stuff that hadn't bugged them through years of wedded life. Henry VIII's push against Catherine of Aragon shows how purity checks morphed into gears of global scheming. Henry bought the reports and even admitted later he'd found Catherine untouched, but he flipped to argue their bond was void because of her prior tie to his brother. The flip-flop exposes how these checks got twisted, rolled out when handy, and ditched when they clashed with bigger plans. The mind games were deliberate and organized. Leaders and lords knew the dread of a possible check often hit harder than the check itself. Women, aware they could face probing anytime, lived in endless worry, their actions molded by the risk of abrupt, deep invasion. This dread bred a vibe of suspicion among highborn ladies. They policed their own forms relentlessly, hunting for hints that might get misread in checks. They skipped things that could harm their barriers, even if those were key for their well-being or joy. They existed as captives inside their skin. The ripple on old wedding traditions ran deep and stuck around. Marriage nights shifted to staged shows instead of private bonds. Pairs went into their first close moment knowing proof of the woman's purity would get picked over come dawn. The push to show blood frequently led to wounding encounters that marked both sides forever. Some duos cooked up fancy routines to nail the checks. They de-stash animal blood to dab on linens or planned for the woman to get nicked a bit during the act to force some flow. These setups flipped what should have been tender links into sly tricks. The staff and palace workers who joined these routines were in on the ongoing harm. They got the hurt and shame they were dishing out. Still, they kept at it because bailing meant losing jobs or catching heat themselves. The setup built chains of folks who kept the harm rolling while pretending to chase nobler aims. Palace hubs turned into stages of shame where women's hidden instants got spun into open displays. Palace folks would cluster to watch checks, chit-chat on outcomes, and fan whispers about what went down. The shame was built to be out there and endless. The record-keeping habits made sure the pain from these checks would ripple across ages. Palace writers jotted every bit about women's forms, their vibes during trials, and the calls from their probers. These notes got stashed in royal vaults where they could be pulled for years or eras. Catherine of Aragon's check papers got hauled into legal fights long after she was gone. Experts and faith thinkers kept hashing over her barriers state way past when it mattered. Her form turned into a history piece to dissect, not a person's story to honor. The worldwide fallout from flunked checks was huge. A queen with doubted purity could kick off embassy messes, hitting several nations. Trade pacts could get axed, war bonds snapped, and fights sparked off the back of private probes. The crash of alliance weddings from purity doubts set off chain reactions of global chaos. Lands that had sunk resources into royal ties saw their hard deals turn to trash. The cash and power hits from botched checks tallied in countless lives and piles of treasure. Some realms rolled out rules, demanding checks by separate midwife crews to lock in truth. These rules baked in the harm while acting like they guarded against tricks. They spawned offices of invasion that handled women's forms like national assets to oversee. The prep for check runners shows how baked in this harm was. Midwives and healers got targeted lessons on running purity trials, what to spot, and how to log their calls. They learned to push past any gut pull against breaching women's space for the sake of wider power plays. These prep courses built job classes of folks whose work hinged on readiness to skin women's forms. They honed skills and methods with zero health upside, but massive scheme value. They turned into tuned tools of control while posing as health and ethics workers. The fight-back moves cooked up by women back then highlight their wild toughness and smarts. They wove loose circles for swapping tips on outlasting checks. They crafted body-fooling tricks that needed sharp know-how on builds and mixes. Some ladies got ace at timing checks to line up with body cycles that could hide signs of past closeness. They mastered holding their feelings in check during trials, to dodge handing over extra proof of so-called wrongs. They shaped themselves into actors who could weather shaming stares. Through smart setup and killer poise, the faith-bound women who ran some checks grappled with brutal clashes between their holy views and their jobs. Sisters and other spiritual types often got picked to probe high women since their own purity oaths supposedly made them steadier judges of female cleanness. These faith probers had to square their ideas on human worth and soul value with joining in routine breaches. Some bowed out and took hits for standing firm. Others boxed off their deeds, seeing checks as holy tasks over people ties. The crafting of health tools just for purity trials shows the tech porn to these habits. Experts built gadgets to dig into women's forms better, gauge barrier stuff more spot on, and log finds more sharp. These gadgets got made with the same detail and care as real health gear, but they had no true health aim. They were arms dressed as science kit, controlled devices sold as knowledge tools. The cash pulls that fueled these habits were giant and everywhere. Midwives and healers doing checks got fat pay for their work. Palace workers setting up trials snagged extras and climbed chances. The whole setup dished out money wins for jumping into routine harm. These cash hooks locked in purity trials even when folks knew the damage. Too many cashed in to let ethics mess with good business. The art and story takes on these trials show how far they sank into old culture. Paintings, wall hangings, and pen pieces often showed purity checks as standard and needed bits of high life. These culture bits made harm every day by framing it as art fodder. A well-known 1579 portrait of Queen Elizabeth, dubbed the untouched ruler, has her gripping a sieve, and a 1611 wood print by Cesare Ripa shows chastity as figure batting off love with one hand and clutching a sieve in the other. Even ages after the roughest habits faded, art kept cheering the signs and notions that backed routine breaches of women's forms. The law setups that backed purity trials set patterns that shaped rules for ages. Courts built out full steps for running checks, weighing proof, and setting penalties. These law builds locked in harm while posing as fairness. Law experts penned long takes on right ways to do purity trials, how trusty different probe styles were, and fitting fixes for varied calls. This spawned study fields rooted in breaching women's forms, while acting to chase law and ethics aims. The mind tricks used to ready women for checks were slick and mean. Palace workers built ways to crack women's pushback, to talk them into joining their own breach, and to stop them from calling out. The handling. These mind prep tricks covered shutting them off, scares, deals for playing along, and staged shows of what happened if you fought. They aimed to shatter women's fire before the body probe kicked off. The follow-up steps for flunked checks were just as organized and harsh. Courts built detailed pots for hitting women, who bombed trials, handling the scheme fallout from busted unions, and dumping women no longer handy as power pieces. These pots covered choices like killings, bootouts, lockups, and forced faith shifts. They handled women as toss-away goods whose slip on purity rules okayed any hurt level. The worldwide webs that backed purity trials show how broad and teamed up these habits were. Courts all over Europe swapped notes on probe tricks, matched outcomes, and sensed their fixes to botch checks. These webs made sure women couldn't dodge stares by shifting lands or hunting shield from other bosses. The setup spanned borders in reach and solid in goal, weaving a trap net that snared women no matter spot or rank. The money math that picked when checks were needed exposes the chilly, machine side of these calls. Palace workers built equations for weighing if the power-ups from testing beat the drags and risks of probes. These maths handled women's pain as a bill to juggle over an ethics worry to skip. They boiled down human worth to line items in scheme books. The tech leaps that sharpened probe tricks show how much brain power went into nailing these breaches. Health seekers built fresh ways to spot signs of closeness, new gadgets for deeper checks, and new log setups for keeping proof. These leaps got chased with the same drive and spark as helpful health jumps. They stand for a huge pour of human smarts into backing routine control. The prep guides used to school probe crews expose the office-like side of these runs. Thick handbooks laid out right probe steps, slip-ups to dodge, and fitting fixes to varied calls. These handbooks handled breaching women's forms as a skill to ace over a wrong to skip. They built job norms for running harm while framing it as real health work. The mind fallout from checks often stung worse than the body breach itself. Women who'd been through testing shared ongoing scars that hit their bonds, their self-view, and their trust in folks. Loads of women never bounced back from getting shrunk to things for probing. They battled closeness, built self-hurt habits, and carried non-stop worry about their forms getting eyed again. The culture shrugged to these habits, locked in that fight back was scarce and weak. Life taught women that checks were needed and right, that their unease mattered less than steady power, and that bucking trials was greedy and wrecking. This life scripting worked so well that tons of women joined their own breach freely, thinking they chased bigger aims and met key group duties. The shadow of old purity trials stretches way past those times. The thoughts and vibes that okayed these habits keep shaping how groups handle women's forms ages later. Today's purity checks in spots around the globe pull straight from old European ways. Purity checks pop up most in Asia and the Middle East plus North and South Africa. The tricks might have changed, but the core idea that women's forms need others' eyes and reigns stays the same. The health world's long run of handling women as birth systems as stuff for male rule and study links back to old probe habits. The notion that women as forms fit for male boss digs got buried deep in health teaching and doing. The law setups that still okay purity checks in some spots now are straight kids of old palace steps. Docs in the US can legally run purity checks. The setup frames that once backed routine probing of high women keep running in tweaked shapes. The mind patterns that purity check victims show now match those noted in old records. The scars, the embarrassment, the split from their own skin, and the tough time building close ties. All these hits got spotted by old watchers, but the habits rolled on. Today's pushback on purity checks mirrors the paths old women carved. Current fighters pull loads of the same points, hit the same walls, and use tons of the same moves that old women built to guard themselves and others. The global rights push slam on purity checks stands as a no to thoughts and habits that ruled European life for ages. In October 2018, the UN rights group, UN Women, and the World Health Crew pushed for banning purity checks as a hurtful, shaming, and scarring act that's violence on women. Still, these habits hanging on in twisted ways worldwide shows how sunken these notions got in human life. The take that women's close purity is everybody's business over private life keeps swaying rules, health, and group plans in loads of spots. The tales of women like Blanche of Navarre, Catherine of Aragon, and Joan of Arc nudge us that breaching women as forms for power and faith grabs has deep roots and awful fallout. Their pain wasn't side noise to old power setups. It was core to how control worked and how groups kept grips on female closeness. These women tackled their trials with guts, smarts, and grace their probers couldn't touch. They bore breaches that'd crush lots of folks today. Still, they kept pushing for their say, their names, and their personhood. Their fight back chipped holes in control webs that looked rock solid. Their no to shame without a peep fired up other women to doubt bosses and call for better. Their tales turned into gather spots for later women crews who battled to grab back rule over their own skin. The probe rooms where these women hurt have crumbled to dirt long ago. The guys who called for their breach got wiped from records. But the guts these women flashed in their worst spots keeps firing up folks who battle wrongs now. Blanche of Navarre's bare form, shaking in that icy stone room in 1453, stood for every woman ever shrunk to a thing for male scans. Her shame was organized, backed by law, and seen as everyday by her world. Yet she made it through, and her making it was its own stand against pulls that aimed to wreck her personhood.